I'm continuing my introduction to Dante's Divine Comedy, and today I want to talk a little bit about the sort of two sides of Dante himself. We're talking about Dante Alighieri, who lived in the 13th and 14th century, which is to say in the 1200s. He was born in 1265, and then the early 1300s in Florence. Now, Dante was both a poet, that's well known. He wrote the Divine Comedy, but he also wrote other types of poetry, and he was also a political figure. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the politics. We're going to talk a lot about the politics of Florence, but we'll see that we're talking about universal themes in politics. Whatever's happening in Florence is kind of the way we see politics all over the place and in all times and places, not just in Italy, but everywhere. Now, Dante was known in his early career as a love poet, and he wrote a collection of poems which was published in a kind of very odd, slender volume called La Vita Nuova, The New Life. And La Vita Nuova is not just a collection of poems, which you might expect it to be, but it's poems together with commentary and literary criticism of those poems integrated with a little bit of memoir and autobiography written by Dante himself. So you have a remarkable phenomenon. The poet is writing the poem, but then he's also playing critic to the poem, and he's telling you how the poem came about and how it fits into the narrative of his own life. So this is a kind of, well, I'd call it a minor masterpiece by Dante in his early career, something that probably would have been we'd study today, even if Dante had not written the Divine Comedy. But there's no comparison in scope, in range, in fame, in importance between La Vita Nuova and Dante's great magnum opus, the Divine Comedy. But Dante, people don't know as well, was also a thoroughly political figure. And he was part of the internecine politics of this important medieval city called Florence. Florence is, by the way, 30 or 40 miles north of Rome. And at that time, Rome and Florence, there was no country called Italy. In fact, there was no country called Italy until the 19th century. And so Italy was divided into little combative city-states that were rivals in economic power, rivals, and they fought over water rights, and they fought over this castle belongs on the border, it belongs to us, not to you. So there was a lot of rivalry between these Italian city-states. But the rivalry also existed in a larger context. I'll come to that context in a moment. Let me talk about Florence for a moment. A city of about 100,000 people, a city with smaller than today's Florence and surrounded by tall walls. Medieval cities had to be walled to protect them from outside aggression. And inside of Florence, of course, very densely packed, and most people lived most of their life outdoors. Why outdoors? Well, remember, there was no electric lighting, obviously. There was even no good way to heat homes. So by and large, people spent a lot of their day outside. And that means that their lives were public. And that means that everybody knew everybody else's business. And that meant that there were a lot of local conflicts that arose, local kind of clashes. Sometimes these clashes were between the merchant class and the aristocratic class. Sometimes they were over grievances that were very personal. There was a massacre in Florence that was caused in the 1200s over a prominent man in Florence who was engaged to be married to a woman. He got a better offer from another woman, so he snubbed the first one. And it ended up that the bridegroom, members of his family, members of rival families, all end up killed. So this is like Godfather type behavior. But there it is, going all the way back into the 13th century. And so this is the world into which Dante was born. And Dante was also a political figure himself, and he became part of the ruling council of Florence. He was one of the handful of men that made decisions for the city. Now, his tenure there was short because they had a kind of rotational system. But even when Dante was not doing that, he was an ambassador. He had important diplomatic posts. So he was a successful politician in Florence, until something happened, which we'll get to, that sent him into exile. Now, If we think of the rivalries in Florence, they have to be set against the bigger rivalries that were occurring across Italy and in Europe at the time. Now, if you think of Italy is shaped like a boot, and if you think of the boot of Italy, the top third of Italy was these independent city-states, and they were enemies of each other for the most part. We're talking about places like, well, Florence was probably the most prominent, but there's also Siena and Lucca and Arezzo and Pisa. And so these are the dueling city-states, all of which were fiercely independent, although sometimes they made alliances for military and other purposes. Now, the middle of Italy, which includes Rome, this is central Italy, was ruled by the papacy, by the Pope. And when we say ruled by the Pope, I don't mean that the Pope was kind of the spiritual authority. The Pope had political and military control over the middle of Italy. The Pope functioned in all practical respects as a kind of monarch over Middle Italy. And then the southern part of Italy, this would include, for example, the island of Sicily. It would include Naples, Italians called Napoli. So that this whole area in southern Italy was ruled by a king. And this was a French king. But this French king was also named in Dante's time the head of the Holy Roman Empire. What's the Holy Roman Empire? Well, it's actually an empire that goes all the way back to Charlemagne in the year 800. The Holy Roman Empire was the ruled by the king, very powerful entity, not just in Italy, but all throughout Europe. Now, what happens is that the Holy Roman Emperor decides it would be a good idea for him to control not just the south of Italy, but also the north. And you can imagine how this news would be received by the Pope. Why? Because the Pope, a guy named Boniface VIII, would now be trapped between the Holy Roman Empire on the north and on the south. So the Holy Roman Emperor, a guy named Frederick II, Frederick Hohenstaufen, that's his name, gets into a rivalry with the Pope. Now you may say, wait a minute, aren't all these guys Christians? What are you talking? Why would they clash? Well, they're clashing because of the rival domains of, you can say, church and state. Now, it's not that the church, as I say, is a spiritual power and the state is the temporal power. No, as I mentioned, the church itself has temporal power. And similarly, the head of the Holy Roman Empire also claims to be God's man. So the real issue is, who is God's top man? Yes, it's nice for the papacy to cooperate with the Holy Roman Empire. Yes, they're both within the Christian orbit, but who's kind of numero uno? That's what the fight is about. It's an old style a struggle for political power. And the point I'm trying to make is that this larger conflict that's occurring in Europe is then reflected right in Florence. Why? Because when you have factions in Florence, what always happens in these situations is the factions then go to bigger powers for support. They basically go, you help us against those guys. You help us against these guys. So in Florence, recognizing that the two biggest powers in Europe were the papacy on the one hand and the Holy Roman Emperor on the other, one group of Florentines went to the emperor and said, you help us. And that group was called the Ghibellines. And another group in Florence went to the Pope and said, you help us. And that group was called the Guelphs. And so the political struggle that's going on in Florence is between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Now notice that they are appealing for help to outside powers. But this is an important political conflict, not just to understand kind of the background of Dante. Dante, by the way, is a Guelph, but because all of this plays out right in the Divine Comedy itself. The Divine Comedy isn't just some kind of spiritual tract removed from the world. It is actively engaged with historical figures, political figures, military figures, as I mentioned, going all the way back to Adam and Eve, but a lot of the figures are the figures from Dante's own day. Now, not Dante's contemporaries, because Dante's contemporaries are alive, and to be in the Divine Comedy, you have to be dead. But you have to go back a generation or two, you can say the generation of Dante's parents or his grandparents, and the Divine Comedy, I'm talking about hell and purgatory and heaven, are densely populated with all kinds of Italians from Florence and neighboring cities who are part of this political struggle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines.